Hello, this is Heather from Change Path Crochet. In this video, I'd like to show you how to do the chevron stitch. The chevron is basically this zigzag pattern, and each zig and zag, so each of these points, is one chevron. And I'm also doing this in single crochet ridge stitch, so you can see there's ridges along each of these as well, just because it makes it more visually interesting. I usually see it this way. You don't have to do the ridge stitch, you can just do standard single crochet, but for this video I'll show you how to do the ridge stitch as well. So before I start crocheting, I just want to share a little bit about what's happening here, because I have 7 stitches between each of these peaks and valleys. And in order to create the peaks and valleys, I need to increase stitches at the peak and decrease stitches in the valleys, and then it ends up creating this shape. So for this example, I have 7 stitches between the peaks and valleys. So let me go ahead and write that here so you can see what I'm doing. And then at the top of each of these peaks, there's another stitch here. But in order to make it a peak, I need to add 2 more. And that means to keep this even, we need to subtract a stitch from each side of the bottom of the peak, and also 1 on each end we need to subtract as well. So basically the stitch that you're adding here at the top on one side, you need to subtract it on the other side, in the valley of that same chevron on both sides. Okay, so you end up having 3 in your peaks, and you end up skipping 2 in the valleys unless you're on the end, in which case you're only skipping 1 stitch. Okay, so to figure out how many stitches you need to start with, we need to figure out how many we need for each chevron. So when we're doing our chain, we need to have the 7 here and 7 here. So we start with 14 chains. We also need the chain that we're going to skip at the bottom of each side of the chevron. So that is another 2 chains that we need. And we also need the chain that we're going to do 3 single crochets in at the top of the peak. So we need 1 more. So the total chains for each of these chevrons is 17, which is 14 plus 2 plus 1. So then, depending on the number of chevrons that you want, you multiply this number times that number of chevrons. In this case, I'm doing 2 just for the sake of the sample. And I'll show you at the end how you figure out how big you want to make this, depending on what you're trying to make. But for this example, I've got 17 times 2 is 34 chains. And then since I'm doing a single crochet, I need to add 1 more chain so that I have a stitch to crochet into at the end. Okay, so let me show you how this works. Now I am using an H hook, which is a 5mm. You can use whatever you want that's going to work with the yarn that you're using. And we start with a slip knot. And again, let me move this out of the way so it's not distracting. We want to start with the 35 chains that I just mentioned. So that's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35. Okay. So I want to start with a single crochet and then skip 1. So remember, we want to skip a stitch, and it's easier to skip the second stitch than the first stitch. So we just skip that second chain there. And I want to have 7 total, including that first stitch. So what do I have here? I've got 5 here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I need 2 more. So that's 7, and plus that skipped stitch. And then I need to do 3 single crochets in the next chain. That'll be our peak. So then I need to do 7 single crochets. That's 6 and 7. So just double check. So here's my triple here, my 3 single crochets in the peak. So then I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It never hurts to double check your counts when you're doing this, especially when you're first starting. So then I need to skip 2 chains and single crochet in the next one. So skip 2 and single crochet in this one and 6 more to make it 7. So here's the stitches that I skipped, and then I've got 7 here. And I need to do 3 to make a peak in the next stitch here. And then this is the end, so I'm going to do 6 and then skip 1 and then do the 7th in the last chain. Skip that and then single crochet in the last stitch. And you can see already we're starting to get our chevron shape. So to do the next row, we're going to chain 1. And turn. And again, I want to do a ridge stitch, which means that I'm going to be crocheting in the back loop only. So if you hold it so your stitches are upright, the back loop is the one that's away from you. So this one is the front loop, this one is the back loop. So I want to crochet in that back loop, and on the end I'm going to crochet in that first stitch and then skip 1. So I'm going to skip the stitch and then crochet in the back loop of this one. So that I have a total of 7 on this end. So that's 5, 6, 7. Okay. I want to do 3 single crochets in the top of the peak. So as you're doing this, every time you get to the peak, you should be crocheting and increasing in the middle stitch of the last row. So in this case, you can see I've got the 3 stitches are here. Okay. So in the middle of the peak, you want to be increasing and do 3 single crochets, again in that back loop only. And then do 7 stitches in between. And then I need to skip 2 stitches. So I always like to make sure I've got my 7 there, but also you can tell because if you look here, I've got my 2 chains that I skipped. And so the stitches that I should be skipping are the 2 that are on opposite sides of the 2 chains that I'm skipping, so that they always happen in the same spot. So that's these 2. So I want to stitch into the next one. Okay, so that's 7. 7 after you've skipped those 2. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I need to increase in the peak. And then I'm on the end, so I need to do 6 and then skip 1 and then do the last of the 7 after that. Yep, split the yarn. It happens. Okay, so I'm on my last 2 stitches. I need to skip that one and then stitch in the last stitch. Okay, so you can see that we've got our chevron starting here. And you'll see at the end that it kind of does a little flip up, and once you get a lot here, it'll just look like a straight end. So that's one of the reasons I like skipping the second stitch, is it helps you have a straighter edge. And it also doesn't want to curl as much if you do it that way. If you skip the first stitch, sometimes it'll want to curl on you. Okay. So from there, you would just keep going. And so you always want to stitch in the first stitch, skip 1, do the rest of whatever the pattern is that you're doing. In this case, I was doing 7. Do your increase, which is 3 stitches, and then do 7 more. Skip 2, and then do 7, increase 3, and then you would keep going however many chevrons you're doing, and then when you get to the end, you want to do 6, skip 1, and then do the 7th one. Okay. So the question you might have is, okay, if I want to make a blanket or a scarf or whatever you want to make, how do I figure out how many chevrons I need? And the easiest way I found is to make a swatch like this. So do 2 or 3 rows so you get a good feel for what it's actually going to be like with the yarn and the hook that you're using. And then get out a ruler and figure out between the peaks, what do you have here? So you can figure out, okay, in this case it's about a little less than 3.5 inches. If you stretch it, it's 3.5, you know. So you get a feel for how wide each chevron is going to be. And then say, okay, if I want to do a blanket that is 48 inches wide, then I would do division, do 48 divided by 3.5, and that would tell you how many chevrons you need to make your blanket or whatever you're making. Okay, now in your case, it may not be 3.5, it really depends. You don't have to do 7 stitches in between. If you would like to have longer chevrons, then you can do 8 or 10 or 12 or whatever number you want. But you would do the math the same way to figure it out. So instead of 7, you would have the number that you want to use here, and then basically add 3 to figure out your chains. And then once you do all the multiplication, then you add 1 at the very end because you're doing single crochets. Okay. So there you have it. There's our chevron stitch, which is also the ridge stitch the way that I did it. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me in the comments on this video, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.